Nova O'Neill walks into a luxury boutique and walks out humiliated, dismissed like she didn't belong. What no one inside that store knew was the truth. She wasn't just another teenage girl. She was the daughter of Big Shaq, and the silent owner of the very building they tried to shame her out of. Now, with her father's quiet strength behind her and the city's eyes turning toward the truth, Nova is ready to rewrite the narrative they tried to bury. Lies will be exposed, power will shift, and the girl they tried to erase is the one holding the pen. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun rose like honey over Savannah, sticky and golden, melting across the cobblestone streets and pastel storefronts of a city that never quite told the truth out loud. Beneath the Spanish moss that draped like ghosts over the oaks, the real Savannah breathed, slow, steady, and split. On one side, power, old money, legacy, polished silver and generational entitlement. On the other, resilience, pride, quiet black excellence, not loud, not in your face, but rooted deep like the trees themselves. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't a celebrity here. Not anymore. Not in the way people might think. In Savannah, he was just Big Shaq, the man who repaired the broken scoreboard in the high school gym, without telling anyone, who bought 20 laptops for students after a cyberstorm fried the school's system, who tipped with silence and generosity instead of applause. He didn't walk with an entourage. He walked slow, alone, in jeans and a faded hoodie that still carried traces of chalk dust from mentoring at-risk kids in an after-school program tucked behind an abandoned library. Shaq had money, yes, but Savannah didn't care much for flash, and neither did he. Legacy, for him, was quiet. It showed up in scholarships paid anonymously, in grocery tabs settled for single mothers without ceremony. He had long ago stopped needing to be seen. What mattered now was being present. He lived in an old restored carriage house near Forsyth Park, ivy creeping up the red brick like time reclaiming space. Mornings started early. He'd rise before the heat swelled, sip black coffee on the porch as the city exhaled awake, and then walk 2 blocks to Mitchell Elementary to drop off leftover bakery items for the janitors and kitchen staff. He said little. They smiled wide. Sometimes a boy would run up for a high five. He gave those freely. But this morning was different. Nova was coming home. His daughter, 17 and sharper than broken glass, had just finished a year at a progressive leadership boarding school in Vermont. A world far from the coded looks and layered glances of Southern charm. She had left with hopes to build things, challenge systems, launch projects that would make someone's tomorrow better than today. She was bold, strategic, not naive, but not weathered either. Shaq watched the street from his porch as her car pulled up, a dusty silver hatchback driven by Lucille, his mother and the iron-spined matriarch, who had raised him to stand tall without needing to raise his voice. Lucille gave him a glance that said everything. She wasn't one for long talks. Shaq smiled, stood, and waited. Nova stepped out, long braids tied in a loose bun, a gray hoodie slung off one shoulder. Her eyes scanned the neighborhood, like she was measuring it. The corners, the cracks, the way people stood or shifted when they saw her. She hugged him, tight but brief, and said nothing at first. Then softly, "It feels off." Shaq didn't answer. He just looked at her. He'd noticed it too. Over the past few months, the city had shifted, not in earthquakes or headlines, but in gestures. Restaurants had become colder at the edges. Boutique doors took a second longer to open. Police cruisers loitered longer outside of black-owned businesses. The lines were sharpening, invisible, but real. "Nothing's changed," he said finally, "but everything's been exposed." They rode in silence back home. Nova rolled down her window and let the breeze slap her cheeks like truth. She noticed the shuttered bookstore on Martin Street, the closed mural project Shaq had helped sponsor that never got finished. She noticed the glances from women walking their Pomeranians in yoga gear, the way their eyes flicked from her skin to her hoodie and then away. Inside the house, Lucille unpacked Nova's bags while humming an old gospel tune, and Shaq made eggs. They didn't talk about the tension, not yet. They talked about her school, a digital startup she wanted to create for young entrepreneurs of color, her ideas for transforming underused city spaces, the lack of youth programming in Savannah's West End. She was already seeing the gaps, the pain points. Her voice carried fire, but her tone stayed low. She wasn't here to scream. Shaq listened, always more a vault than a mirror. His eyes lit up when she spoke about her plan to partner with local businesses to create work-study mentorships for high schoolers. He said only, You'll need allies. And she nodded. She always understood the quiet between his words. Later that afternoon, they walked together through downtown. Tourists strolled with their ice cream and sun hats, taking photos of fountains and war statues. Shaq kept a low profile, pulling his cap lower when a few teens recognized him and whispered. He didn't pause. He guided Nova into the flow of the crowd. They passed Vehement Wear, a sleek high-end boutique fronted by glass windows and mannequins, in cream blazers. Nova paused for a beat too long. Shaq felt her shift beside him. I thought about getting a dress for the school summit, she said, not quite asking. Shaq looked at the store, then at her. Walk in. See what you find. But Nova didn't. Not yet. She turned away, uneasy. Her instinct had been honed. Her eyes had learned to spot the red flags behind soft smiles. Back at home, as the cicadas screamed and dusk began to climb the trees, Shaq sat on the porch again. Lucille brought him iced tea, and a look that asked the question she didn't speak. She's seeing it, he said. And she's not backing down. Lucille nodded. And it's her city too. There was something in the air that night, a stillness too calm, like the second before a summer storm. Beneath Savannah's beauty, something was stirring. Not loud, not yet, but soon. It was the kind of day Savannah pretended would last forever. Warm, cloudless, breeze just enough to keep the sidewalks from baking. Nova walked downtown with purpose. She didn't need anyone to validate her place in this city, but she knew how these streets worked. There were spaces she passed through and spaces she entered. And today she planned to enter one of the latter. Vivant Wear, a luxury boutique known for its carefully curated fashion, its careful selection of clientele, and its not-so-subtle gatekeeping. The glass storefront shimmered in the sunlight. Inside it was pristine, ivory walls, chrome racks, minimalist displays. It smelled like expensive cologne and exclusivity. Nova paused briefly at the entrance. Her hoodie was simple, but clean. Sneakers worn but classic. She walked in, posture upright, eyes locked on the racks of neutral-toned blazers and polished silhouettes. It wasn't about vanity. She needed something sharp for her upcoming leadership summit. Something that said confidence without apology. She was just scanning a rack of blouses when she felt it. The hush. That subtle shift in the air. The absence of greeting. The unspoken question floating in every glance. Behind the counter, Bryce Danton stood with a tablet in one hand and an air of superiority he didn't bother concealing. Late 30s, pressed button down, a face sculpted into polite condescension. He watched her not like a customer, but like a trespasser. Still, he approached slowly, deliberately, offering the kind of smile that came with conditions. Hi there, he said, voice smooth but hollow. Can I help you with something? Nova offered a short nod, already hearing the edge in his tone. Just browsing. Bryce didn't move. This store caters to professional clients. We carry very specific pieces, limited availability, high ticket. He let that hang in the air like a warning disguised as a courtesy. Nova didn't flinch. That's what I came for. She stepped toward a nearby blazer, running her fingers across the stitching. He watched her hand as though it were a threat. Unfortunately, he said, stepping closer now, we're currently restocking some of our collection, and we do prefer customers make appointments when browsing certain lines. Nova turned, raising an eyebrow. There was no sign about appointments. Bryce's jaw tightened. Perhaps I can recommend a few other stores in the area. One's more accessible. There it was. Not loud, but sharp. Nova stayed still. I'm exactly where I meant to be. It wasn't anger in her voice. It was clarity. Bryce looked toward the entrance, gave a slight nod, and a moment later, a tall, lean man, in a dark suit store security, emerged from the back hallway. No words were exchanged, just a presence, large enough to create pressure. We're going to ask you to leave, Bryce said, still wearing that empty smile. We've had some incidents with loitering this week. I'm sure you understand. Nova's heart pounded, not from fear but from fury that had nowhere to go. She looked at the security guard, then back at Bryce, and for a long second, no one moved. I'm not loitering, she said calmly. I'm shopping. Or I was. We're asking you to leave, Bryce repeated, voice louder now. Before we escalate this further. Nova looked around. 3 other customers in the store, all white, all silent, pretending not to see what was happening. But one of them, a girl in her 20s near the accessory table, had her phone out just below chest level. Subtle. Framing. Recording. Nova gave no response. She lifted her chin, gave one last look at the blazer she would have bought, and turned. She didn't plead, didn't argue. She walked past the security guard, out the door, and into the afternoon sun. No one followed, but the silence inside that boutique was now stained. Out on the sidewalk, Nova didn't break pace. She walked 2 blocks before her hands trembled. She found a bench under a tree and sat down, staring at the street, like it might explain what had just happened. She knew. Of course she knew. But knowing didn't make it less absurd, less violating, less real. She pulled out her phone, thumb hovering over her contacts, not sure if she wanted to tell her father. Not yet. Not with the way he carried weight in his chest like armor. Instead, she opened her notes app and began typing, a record, not a rant. Just the facts, just the order of events, so that when her fire rose later, she'd have something to anchor it. Across town, the girl from the boutique was already uploading. She had over 200,000 followers, most of them Gen Z, most of them attuned to microaggressions, dressed in professional clothing. The video, though only 28 seconds, captured it all. The condescending tone, the dismissive language, the summoning of security. No screaming, no threats, just the soft brutality of "you don't belong here." The caption was simple. Why is she being asked to leave? This is Vivint Ware in Savannah. Within an hour it had 20,000 views. By nightfall, over 1 million. Nova didn't know yet. She would find out later, much later, that the storm had already begun, quietly, on a screen in someone's hand. But right now, she just sat on that bench beneath the trees, her dignity intact but bruised, her silence louder than Bryce could have imagined. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the girl he'd just ejected wasn't just another teenager. She was the daughter of the man who owned the very floor beneath his feet. And Savannah was about to learn who held the real keys. The sun had barely risen the next morning when Savannah's quiet charm was shattered by the soundless thunder of a viral video. It didn't scream. It didn't beg. It just existed. 28 seconds of pure discomfort wrapped in politeness. Posted on a TikTok account known for documenting social injustice in unexpected places, the video started slow and ended with a storm. A girl unnamed, unreadable, was calmly told to leave Vivint Ware by a manager in a pressed shirt and artificial smile. The store was clean, stylish, and oppressive in a way you couldn't quite name unless you'd lived it. She had touched a blazer. He had touched a nerve. The moment the security guard appeared, the comments began rolling in. This again? She didn't raise her voice. Why is he calling security? Watch how he never actually explains himself. Another case of shopping while black. Within hours, it was on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook groups that usually only shared lost pets and city events. The girl's face was turned away from the camera, so her identity stayed hidden for a while. But internet detectives didn't rest. The style of her hoodie, the school emblem stitched faintly on the sleeve, the custom bracelet glinting on her wrist. Clues. Screenshots flew like wildfire. In dorm group chats, former classmates whispered, "Was that Nova O'Neill?" In private Facebook mom circles, "Shaq's girl? I think that's his daughter." The guesses piled up. So did the rage. Major outlets picked it up by noon. Cable news anchors debated it that evening like it was just another trending cultural crisis, instead of a lived reality for millions. On one side, anchors expressed concern over growing retail discrimination. On the other, guests from corporate boards warned about social media mob culture and the need to see the full story. No one had spoken to the girl. Yet, Vivint Ware corporate issued a press statement just before dinner. It was tone-deaf to the point of offense. "We are aware of the recent video circulating online. At Vivint Ware, we pride ourselves on creating a safe, welcoming environment for all customers. While we cannot comment on internal matters, we take these allegations seriously. The team is reviewing conduct protocol with all staff members." There was no apology, no accountability, no name acknowledgement, no promise of change, just corporate evasion, dressed in PR polish. In homes across Savannah, it played out on screens. Phones, laptops, televisions, looping endlessly. And in one restored carriage house near Forsyth Park, Shaquille O'Neal sat in silence, his massive frame hunched slightly, as he stared at the video on a muted screen, his morning coffee untouched, his jaw set, his heart unsure what it wanted to believe. He had watched the clip 3 times already, not because he didn't understand it, but because something had stirred, an unease that crawled beneath his ribs. The posture, the walk, the turn of the shoulder, familiar, unmistakable. But it wasn't until the 4th time that he saw it. As the girl reached for her phone, her left hand tilted just enough to catch the light, and there it was, the bracelet, woven silver and navy threads. A tiny engraving on the charm. Nina Lo Nova Lucille O'Neill. He had given it to her last year before she left for Vermont, a quiet way of saying he was always with her. She'd never stopped wearing it, and now, there it was, frozen in the grainy pixels of viral history. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded together like a prayer he hadn't realized he was saying. Lucille entered from the kitchen carrying a plate of toast. She stopped mid-step when she saw his face. "What is it?" she asked, setting the plate down slowly. Shaq didn't speak for a moment. He simply turned the laptop so she could see the paused frame. The moment before Nova turned to leave. The bracelet, catching sunlight. Lucille's breath caught. "That's our girl." Shaq nodded once, heavy with the kind of anger that wasn't explosive, but buried, molten, waiting. He wasn't surprised. Not really. But knowing and seeing were 2 different beasts. And seeing his daughter composed, silent, pushed out of a place she had every right to be in, awakened something in him that hadn't stirred in years. But he didn't curse, didn't throw a chair. He closed the laptop slowly, slid it aside, and stood up. "She didn't tell us," Lucille said quietly. "No," he replied, "because she knew we'd carry it." Out the window, the street looked the same, calm. But in Savannah things weren't going to stay quiet for long. Inside the boutique, Bryce Danton had no idea the video had gone viral. He was in a meeting with the assistant regional director, smugly recounting the minor disruption the day before. He hadn't seen the views climbing. He hadn't read the comment. He hadn't noticed the news van parked 2 blocks down, waiting for an angle. What he also didn't know, not yet, was that the girl he dismissed wasn't some random teenager with a chip on her shoulder. She was the only daughter of the man who signed the lease on the very building he strutted through each morning. And that man? He had just decided it was time to step out of the shadows. Not to make noise, but to set things right, one silent reckoning at a time. The evening air was heavy with stillness, the kind that holds its breath before something shifts. The house remained quiet, even as Savannah buzzed beyond its ivy-laced walls. Inside, the soft clinking of ice in a glass, and the low hum of Lucille's gospel record, were the only sounds. Shaq stood at the kitchen window, arms folded, eyes distant. The bracelet's reflection still lingered in his memory, sharper than any headline or news clip. He had watched the video again, not for proof, but for pain. Not for validation, but for understanding. Lucille entered behind him, drying her hands with a towel, her eyes already reading the storm in his silence. "You've been still too long," she said plainly, not as a complaint, but as a signal. "What's circling your mind?" Shaq turned toward her, jaw tight, voice low. "She walked out of that store like she ain't carry my name. Like she ain't carry her own power." Lucille placed the towel down and poured herself some tea. "She carried dignity, baby. That's the kind you don't shout with." Shaq nodded slowly. But she shouldn't have had to. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with shared memory, lived experience, and the weight of names. Names that bought access, and names that invited suspicion. Shaq hadn't built his fortune to be flaunted. He had learned early that real power didn't walk with noise. It built quietly, it protected, it moved systems, not crowds. 6 months ago he'd made a move that no one, not even Nova, knew about. A corner property downtown had gone up for sale, discreetly. He had bought it through a shell trust, a clean transaction with a purpose deeper than profit. The boutique, Vivant Wear, had a lease through a third-party management group. He'd let it operate untouched. He never stepped foot inside. He hadn't intended to interfere. Not unless there was a reason. And now, here it was. Lucille sat at the kitchen table, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. "You bought it for her," she said softly. "Already knowing, didn't you?" Shaq exhaled. "Was gonna tell her on her birthday. Set up a quiet transfer. Let her redesign the place. Make it hers. A spot for young creators. Clothing. Art. Whatever she wanted." Lucille stirred her tea, letting the spoon rest against the porcelain. "You kept it quiet like everything else. Just like your scholarships. The housing projects. The rec center fund. My name's loud enough, Shaq replied. Didn't need it on a plaque. She smiled faintly. Your action's been louder, baby. But maybe it's time they had a face. He sat down across from her, the weight of restraint still pressing on his shoulders. She didn't even tell me, he said, more to himself than to her. She came home, took that, held it, and stayed quiet. Lucille leaned forward. Because she thought it was hers to carry. You raised her that way. It was nearly midnight when Nova came downstairs, her phone clutched tight in her hand. Her face was dry, but her eyes gave her away. Tired, guarded, hurt. Not from what had happened at Vivint, but from what she hadn't done in the moment. She walked into the kitchen slowly, stopping when she saw them both sitting in that quiet, unspoken space. I didn't tell you, she said, her voice a mere whisper, because I didn't want to make it bigger. Shaq looked up. It was already big, Nova. Just not loud. She stood by the counter, not quite sitting, not quite pacing. I froze. I've been talking about change, about systems and justice, and when it was me, I didn't even say anything. You did, Lucille interjected gently. You left with your head up. You didn't give them what they wanted. Nova's voice cracked. It didn't feel brave. Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Silence ain't weakness, he said, voice steady. It's the beginning of a better answer. Sometimes the loudest fight is in how you walk away. Nova finally sat down. The room held her grief like a bowl holds water. Not to spill it, but to let it rest. Then Shaq opened a drawer beside him, pulled out a folder, and slid it across the table toward her. She looked at it, confused. What's this? Deed, he said, and some paperwork. She opened it slowly. It took a moment for her eyes to process the name, Lucille and Nova Holdings LLC. Underneath ownership rights, trustee documentation, and building details. She looked up, stunned. You. I bought it 6 months ago. Thought I'd give it to you on your 18th. Not as a gift. As a platform. You talked about creating spaces for voices like yours. I figured let's start with a storefront. Nova stared at the pages, then at him. The tears didn't come fast, but when they did, they arrived without sobs. Just quiet, steady acknowledgement, of trust, of love, of weight. You were already the owner, she whispered. Shaq nodded. Which means I got a problem walking around in my store. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her hoodie, a shaky laugh slipping through. That's poetic. Life tends to be, Lucille said, sipping her tea like she already knew the next 10 steps. Shaq looked at Nova, firm but kind. You ready to walk back in there? Not for revenge, for restoration. Nova nodded, slow but sure. I don't want to tear it down. I want to rebuild it right. Lucille stood smoothing her apron and started clearing the mugs. Then it's time the city learns who's really holding the keys. Outside, the streets still slept under their cover of moonlight. But Savannah's silence had shifted. A new chapter had begun. Not with a bang, but with a name reclaimed and a legacy quietly lit. The bell above Vunware's door gave a soft chime as Shaq stepped inside. The boutique looked the same as it had in the video. Polished marble floors, whitewashed walls, and an air of curated exclusivity that now reeked of something foul. A quiet tension settled over the store as the sales associate at the counter looked up and stiffened. She didn't say a word, just gave a silent nod toward the back office where Bryce usually held court like a small-town king. Shaq moved slowly, deliberately, his footsteps heavy on the smooth tile, each one echoing with the kind of purpose you couldn't fake. He carried no entourage, no lawyer, no camera crew, just a manila envelope, tucked under his arm and decades of calm power in his stride. Bryce was seated behind a sleek desk when the knock came, not loud but firm enough to make him look up. His smile formed instinctively, that same trained expression he used for high-value customers and donors' wives. It faltered the second he saw who entered. Shaq stepped in without waiting to be invited. "Can I help you?" Bryce asked, already trying to summon his composure. Shaq didn't answer immediately. He placed the envelope on the desk and took a seat across from him. No rush, no heat. Just gravity. "Your name is on the complaint," Shaq said, his voice quiet. "Your voice is on the video. But my name is on the lease." Bryce blinked, confusion flashing before he masked it with practiced arrogance. "I'm not sure I follow." "You will," Shaq interrupted, sliding the folder toward him. "Read it." Bryce opened the envelope. "Deed copies. ownership filings, leaseholder agreements. Every page unmistakably linked to Lucille and Nova Holdings. And at the bottom, the signature Shaquille O'Neal. The illusion crumbled as his face lost all pretense of color. You're the— I'm the landlord, Shaq said, leaning back. And the father of the girl you tried to push out with your smile, and a security guard. Bryce swallowed hard. The office felt smaller now, tighter. His throat dried with a panic he couldn't show. Look, I didn't know who she was. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Shaq cut in. But you said enough. There was a pause, stretched thin like thread about to snap. Bryce braced for it. The termination, the public fallout, the reckoning he knew he had earned. But it didn't come. Instead, Shaq stood. You have 1 week, he said, turning toward the door, to show me why this place deserves to stand. Or you'll be gone. Bryce stood too, almost in protest. You're not firing me? Shaq looked back. Not yet. I don't believe in loud punishments. I believe in quiet tests. This is yours. And with that he left. No threats. No grand gestures. Just truth and consequence wrapped in dignity. But Bryce didn't see it as mercy. He saw it as humiliation. And in humiliation, he found something uglier. Desperation. Later that evening, in a private dining room on the edge of the city's historic district, Bryce nursed a whiskey while fidgeting with his cufflink. The table across from him belonged to Grant Ashcroft, a name not found on plaques but whispered behind business deals and campaign fundraisers. Real estate tycoon, legacy power broker, and a man with no love for Shaquille O'Neal's quiet rise in Savannah. Ashcroft was tall, silver-haired, and always 10 steps ahead of anyone in the room. He tapped his fingers lightly against the wood, as Bryce explained, nervously recounting what had happened. So let me get this straight, Ashcroft said finally, his voice smooth as lacquer. You embarrassed a teenage girl, who turned out to be the daughter of the man who owns your building. Yes, sir, Bryce muttered. And that man just gave you a second chance instead of dragging you through the court of public opinion. Bryce nodded. I don't understand what game he's playing. Ashcroft leaned forward. It's not a game. It's a message. He wants to win differently. Make you sweat. That kind of power? It's harder to counter. Bryce sat still, watching Ashcroft pour himself a second glass. The older man offered a crooked smile, the kind used by men who dealt in whispers and back doors. I've been watching O'Neal for years, Ashcroft said. He's too quiet, too generous. That makes people trust him. That makes him dangerous. Bryce shifted in his seat. So what do you want me to do? Ashcroft's eyes gleamed. Find something. A flaw. A misuse of funds. A deal that wasn't clean. If he keeps winning hearts, he becomes untouchable. I need leverage. And you owe me for your silence. Bryce froze. Silence? I've known about your conduct at Vivant for months, Ashcroft said calmly. You're lucky the girl went quietly. Others might not have. Now you work for me. Bring him down quietly. Or lose everything. There it was. A lifeline dressed as a noose. Bryce nodded slowly. Eyes cold now. I'll find something. Ashcroft raised his glass. Good. The city doesn't belong to people who whisper change. It belongs to people who know how to stop it before it spreads. Outside, Savannah glowed under antique lanterns and magnolia trees, unaware that a different kind of war had begun. Not with violence, but with reputation. And at the center of it stood Big Shaq, unaware that his silence had just drawn enemies from the shadows. By Monday morning, Nova stepped back into Vivant Ware, not as the owner's daughter, not as the wronged girl from the viral video, but as an anonymous intern with a quiet mission and sharper eyes than before. She wore her hair differently now, pulled tight into a clean bun, her hoodie replaced by a cream button-down and flats. She looked like she belonged, but she wasn't there to fit in. She'd asked Shaq for this, told him she needed to see the rot up close, not to play detective, but to understand the system from the inside, before trying to rebuild it. He didn't question her, just gave her a look that said, don't get swallowed by it. Bryce had barely glanced at her when she'd walked in. He muttered something about new management policies and diversity optics, as if her presence could be repurposed as proof of his reform. He didn't recognize her from the day he'd had her thrown out. Why would he? Hadn't really seen her then, and people like him rarely remembered faces that didn't matter to them. Nova started in the back room. Inventory, tagging, restocking, the kind of work that made her invisible. But that was the point. From the shadows you could hear everything. That's where she met Harper. Floor stylist, self-taught designer, and the only person in the store with flair that didn't come from the racks. She wore what she wanted: oversized blazers, leather boots, a septum ring that caught the light when she smiled. She clocked Nova within 2 minutes. "You're not just here to fold sweaters," Harper said under her breath, eyes fixed on a garment she was steaming. "You've got recon energy." Nova smirked. "I'm just observing." Harper raised an eyebrow, then leaned closer. "Well, observe this. Bryce doesn't just discriminate. He targets women, mostly. Black customers with high-end taste, teens, even staff. He thinks being smooth makes it harmless. It's not." Nova paused, her hands tightening around the hanger she was holding. "Has he ever been reported?" "Reported?" Harper scoffed, voice low. "People walk away. They don't report. They leave bruised, not bleeding." By the end of the day, Nova had already started mapping the patterns. Customers he greeted warmly, ones he ignored. How he hovered too close to certain shoppers. How he handled returns from white women with patience, but rolled his eyes at black customers asking for sizing help. It was subtle, always just beneath the line of overt offense. But it was there, like poison in perfume. That night, Nova started reaching out to old employees. Using a burner email, she messaged 5 women who had once worked at Vivant and left abruptly. 3 responded. One offered screenshots of Bryce's inappropriate DM. Another shared a video she'd secretly recorded of him mocking a Muslim customer after they left. The third sent a resignation letter never submitted. It was scathing, naming specific dates and incidents. Nova compiled everything, not for revenge, for truth, layer by layer. By midweek she had started gaining trust from the in-store team. That's when she met Devin. Quiet, polite, always on time. He handled inventory orders and worked late shifts with near robotic efficiency. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was direct. "You're different," he said once while they closed together. "You watch. Most people here don't." Nova kept it cool. "Watching helps you see what's ignored." Devin nodded, expression unreadable. "Sometimes what's ignored is what gets people hurt." He was right. But what Nova didn't realize was that he wasn't just watching for her. He was watching her and passing what he saw to someone else. Bryce. Bryce had started getting nervous. Ever since Nova joined, subtle shifts unsettled him. His routines felt interrupted. Harper had grown bolder, challenging displays, pushing back on decisions. Staff whispered when they thought he was out of earshot. Devin had become his eyes, not because he trusted him, but because Devin needed the paycheck more than he needed a conscience. Late one evening, Bryce met Devin outside the store, under the excuse of coffee and closing notes. The conversation was clipped, calculated. "She's pulling files," Bryce said, teeth clenched. "Old logs, names. She's building something." Devin hesitated. "Maybe she's just doing the job you said she could do." Bryce narrowed his eyes. "She's not here to work. She's here to expose. And if I go down, I'm not going alone." Devin said nothing. He just nodded once, then walked off, hoodie pulled over his head. The betrayal wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was in the silence that followed. The next day, Nova arrived to find 2 of her email leads suddenly unreachable. One of the video clips was flagged for copyright violation and removed. Her shared drive with Harper had been mysteriously wiped clean overnight. She froze. Someone knew. She cornered Harper in the break room. "We've got a leak. Someone's feeding Bryce info." Harper didn't flinch. "Devin?" Nova didn't answer. She didn't need to. The pieces had started to align. Devin had been too quiet, too conveniently placed. She looked over her shoulder, suddenly aware of how tight the walls were becoming. That night, she didn't go home. She went to the rec center, where Shaq was still coaching kids through after-school drills. He saw her enter and gave a nod, dismissing the last group before she even said a word. She dropped into the bleachers, eyes low, voice tight. "Someone inside is burning the trail. I don't know who I can trust." Shaq sat beside her, quiet. "That means you're close."
"I need more time," she said.
"But if this leaks everything we're building," he interrupted, voice calm. "Then we build again, stronger, wiser." Nova looked at him, something shifting in her. "I didn't expect it to be like this." "Change never asks permission," Shaq replied. It just shows up. The question is whether you're ready to answer. As they sat in the quiet echo of the gym, Nova's phone buzzed. A new message. An anonymous tip from a blocked number. You're not wrong. But not everyone's loyal to the truth. Watch your back. She didn't recognize the number. But she recognized the tone. It had begun. The fight wasn't just on the sales floor now. It was inside the walls. And Nova, armed with silence and strategy, had stepped into the real game. Savannah hummed with the usual ease of warm days and quiet scandal. But beneath its cobblestone charm, something sharp stirred. After Bryce's meeting with Ashcroft, the narrative around Vivantware began to shift. Subtly at first. Then with force. It started with whispers in affluent circles. Then came the carefully placed articles in smaller blogs, the call-in segments on local radio stations, the anonymous posts on message boards that never stayed anonymous for long. According to the news story, Shaquille O'Neal, the benevolent, soft-spoken property owner, had bought the boutique not as a gift for his daughter, but as a way to clean up her reputation after she caused a scene in a respected business. The implication was precise. He was using his name and his money to protect a privileged child from consequences she deserved. And worse, some even claimed the entire incident had been orchestrated, a racially charged stunt to drum up sympathy, ruin reputations, and gain power in a business he had no interest in. Until now, Shaq heard the noise but didn't respond. He never did. He let the waves crash. But Nova heard it too, in the way teachers at her school sent her polite but cautious emails, in how some boutique staff hesitated around her, in the strangers' glances that weren't quite angry, but weren't kind either. She scrolled through the headlines, the comments, the half-truths, and she felt it, the machine at work. The silence didn't last. 1 week after Shaq's visit to the store, a document surfaced online, a scanned ledger with forged accounting records. The document claimed that funds from a children's literacy charity Shaq had supported, one he had anonymously bankrolled for 3 years, had been funneled into the purchase of a commercial property, the same building Vivantware occupied. The signature was almost perfect. The paper aged and marked convincingly. It looked real enough to start the fire. Within hours, the link spread like oil across dry pavement. Local journalists reached out for comment. National accounts began resharing the headline with suspicion. Then judgment. Community hero or business bully? One headline asked. Questions surround Shaq's business dealings amid boutique backlash. Another read. Shaq sat in his study, the folder of the real records untouched on his desk. He knew the truth, knew every dollar in and out. But he also knew how fast a lie could run when dressed in the right font. Lucille found him that night, sitting in the half-light of a flickering desk lamp. She didn't knock, didn't sit. She just leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, face unreadable. "They're coming for the name," she said. Shaq nodded slowly. "They can't get to me any other way." Lucille stepped forward. "This isn't about you, Shaq. This is about us. All of us. That girl walked out of that store with grace. And they're trying to twist that into something ugly because it's easier than facing what really happened." He looked up at her, voice steady. "I thought staying quiet gave me the high ground." "It did," Lucille said. "Until they decided to bury it." She dropped a thin envelope on his desk, legal paperwork sent from Ashcroft's office, hidden in the fine print, an old clause in the original lease agreement for the boutique's first tenant, buried under 2 decades of revisions. A buyout clause. If the current owner was found in breach of public trust, the property could be transferred at market value to an adjacent business owner, a holding company registered to Ashcroft's name. Shaq exhaled, his voice almost a growl. "He's trying to take the building." Lucille nodded. "And if this lie sticks, he'll do it legally." It was a masterstroke of manipulation. Ashcroft had planted seeds on both sides. Discredit Shaq in the court of public opinion while lining up the legal groundwork to seize the property. Bryce, it turned out, was just the match. The fire had been ready to burn all along. Nova stormed into the study minutes later, her phone still open to the news site. Her hands shook as she dropped it on the desk. "They're saying you stole from kids, that you bought me a store to cover your mistake. You didn't even tell anyone it was mine. And now they're making it look like we planned it." Shaq didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, tired but unwavering. "I never told the world," he said, "because I didn't think they deserved the story. But maybe I was wrong." Nova sat on the arm of the chair, her voice quieter now. "What do we do?" Lucille looked between them, then spoke the words that had been burning since the first rumor hit. "This isn't just about a store," she said. "It's about your name, your people's pride. They're using old tricks with new tools. They don't care about truth. They care about control." Shaq opened the real documents, flipping through each page with precision. He laid them out across the desk like battle plans: proof, signatures, transfer history, charity audits. Everything clean. Everything quiet. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he rarely used. The voice on the other end answered instantly. "Shaq, I need you to look at a document that hit the web today," he said. "It's fake. I can prove it. I want it taken apart line by line, publicly." The man on the line paused, then responded, "You're ready to go loud?" Shaq looked at Nova. Not loud, just clear. Over the next 48 hours, a counter-campaign began. No drama, no press tour, just receipts, financial, emotional, and moral, presented through trusted voices in the community. Youth mentors, teachers, former students, business owners who'd partnered with Shaq behind the scenes for years. And Nova, with a quiet blog post titled "Inheritance of Silence," laid out the truth from her own voice, not as a victim but as a witness. Ashcroft didn't blink. He doubled down, filing motion after motion to force the clause into action, arguing that public perception was enough to qualify as breach. His people filed new claims, called for investigations, pushed harder. But Savannah, the real Savannah, was watching, and truth was beginning to walk louder than rumor. The store stood unchanged, for now, but the ground beneath it had started to tremble, and the man who built quietly was about to fight the same way. No fists, no shouting, just truth, strategy, and a name that didn't shake under fire. The store was quieter than usual that morning. No upbeat playlist humming through the speakers, no high-end customers browsing the seasonal display. Just the low, barely audible hum of tension. A silence thick with everything unspoken. Bryce had noticed it too. The staff were still polite, still present, but their eyes had changed. There was caution in them now, calculation, and maybe beneath that, something more dangerous: unity. At exactly 8:45 a.m., Harper called a mandatory staff huddle, a phrase Bryce hated because it implied he wasn't in control. But she used it anyway, in front of him, with the kind of casual confidence he hadn't seen in her before. That confidence came from something solid. Nova was already there, arms folded, expression unreadable. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was no longer the girl who walked out in silence. She had returned with purpose and proof. Devon came last. He lingered by the door, hands in his pockets, torn between loyalty and regret. Nova looked at him once, said nothing. That was enough. He gave a single nod. She returned it. The lines were drawn. Bryce strolled in seconds later, smug and impatient. "What's this about?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light. "We've got a schedule." Harper stepped forward. "This won't take long." Nova turned and placed a small speaker on the counter. She pressed play. At first the room filled with the usual ambient noise of a store floor, hangers clinking, footsteps, then came voices. Not just any voices. Bryce's voice, cold, calculated. "You know how this works," he was saying on the recording. "Keep them moving. Don't engage. They're not buying anything. They just want to feel included." More silence. Then another clip. Bryce again. "If they don't look like they belong, don't treat them like they do." Bryce's face drained of color. "Where did you get—" "Let her finish," Harper said, stepping between him and the speaker. The third recording was grainier. A late-night staff meeting. Bryce mocking a customer's accent, laughing about canceling an interview because the applicant had braids and attitude. Another voice, quieter, disagreed. His reply came sharp. "I don't owe them anything. We're not here to fix their image problems." Nova paused the speaker. She reached into her bag and laid out 3 printed customer complaint forms, all logged, never submitted. She handed over screenshots of Bryce's internal messages from ex-staff who had forwarded them in silence, too afraid to attach their names but tired of carrying the weight. One email thread documented Bryce denying service to a teenage girl who tried to return a blazer her mother bought. He'd flagged her as non-authentic. The receipt proved otherwise. Nova stepped forward. "You want to talk about belonging, Bryce? Let's talk about you forging financials." She held up a USB drive. "We traced the metadata of that fake charity document you helped push online. It came from a desktop inside this store, logged in under your admin credentials." Devon's eyes flicked toward Bryce. Harper folded her arms, watching with surgical attention. You tried to ruin a man's name. Nova continued. You tried to paint me as a charity case and him as a thief. You tried to rewrite a narrative, because you were afraid of what happens when someone like me walks in and doesn't apologize for it. Bryce's mask slipped. You think anyone cares about your little campaign? He snapped. This store was built for a certain clientele. You don't get to rewrite the rules just because your daddy owns the lease. Nova hit record on her phone. Bryce didn't notice. This is what's wrong with all of you, he ranted. You scream racism when you don't get your way. You weaponize sympathy. You hide behind your so-called oppression and expect everyone to kneel. The room froze. Harper's eyes narrowed. Devon stepped forward, finally speaking. And now we all heard you say it. Nova stopped the recording and saved it to a locked folder. She didn't shout. Didn't gloat. She just looked Bryce in the eyes and said, We're done here. Bryce scoffed. What, you're going to put it online, try to cancel me? Nova shook her head. No. We don't need noise. We need consequence. That afternoon, Shaq sat in a clean, glass-walled office 10 floors up in a downtown tower, the headquarters of a private equity firm that held a substantial share in Ashcroft's commercial real estate ventures. Across from him sat two senior investors, both in suits, both holding copies of a portfolio Shaq had assembled with quiet precision. Inside were transcripts, digital forensics, audio clips, and an executive summary of Bryce's conduct, including his direct connection to the forged financial report. Attached was a single-page letter from Shaq himself, highlighting how Ashcroft's support of Bryce's behavior through financial backing posed a threat to the firm's public integrity and investor trust. He didn't demand anything. He simply submitted the truth. The older of the two men finally closed the folder, cleared his throat, and said, We'll need a few days to review. Shaq interrupted, calm but firm. Take your time, but just know, if I release this publicly first, I won't be asking for anything. I'll just let your shareholders decide what kind of empire they want to invest in. No shouting, no threats, just truth laid bare and left to echo. Back at Vivant where Bryce was gone by evening, the locks changed. Staff quietly informed, no press release, just absence. Nova stood at the storefront, watching the sun drop below the skyline. Harper stood beside her, arms crossed, the weight in her chest lighter than it had been in months. Devon lingered by the counter, guilt still thick in his throat. Nova looked at him once, said simply, You can stay, but you earn it. He nodded. Words would come later. Outside, the city buzzed. Rumors would swirl, speculation would follow. But for now, the takedown was complete, not with noise, but with testimony, not with fists, but with facts. And Savannah would have no choice but to listen. Savannah's Business Honors Gala was the kind of event built for spectacle, where reputations were displayed like diamond brooches and alliances were sealed in half-empty glasses of Chardonnay. It was hosted in the Grand Magnolia Hall, a former courthouse turned banquet venue, with towering columns, velvet carpets, and chandeliers heavy enough to collapse ceilings and careers alike. That evening, the elite filed in, dressed to impress. Conversations dipped in small talk and ambition. And at the center of it all stood Grant Ashcroft, his silver hair slicked, his tailored suit pressed to perfection, and his ego barely concealed beneath an affable southern smile. He held court like he always did, with the confidence of a man who had already won. Tonight, he believed, would be the quiet end to a messy chapter. With Bryce gone, and public attention shifting, Ashcroft planned to announce his acquisition of the property that housed Vivint Ware, a move cloaked in urban redevelopment language and long-term vision. No one in the room knew that the ink on the transfer papers had already dried, at least in his mind. The gala's stage was set with golden uplights, and a podium flanked by sponsors' banners. Between award speeches and subtle power plays, Ashcroft would take the mic and declare his expansion plans, effectively absorbing a valuable piece of Savannah's downtown real estate into his portfolio. But that plan, like the confidence it was built on, was about to split at the seams. At 8:47 p.m., two figures entered the room without announcement, without entourage, and without noise. Shaquille O'Neal, in a dark charcoal suit with no tie, walked beside his daughter Nova, who wore a simple but sharp black jumpsuit with a gold pin shaped like a closed fist. No flash, just presence. Heads turned, not out of fanfare, but curiosity. The room knew them, but didn't know them, not yet. Ashcroft spotted them from across the room, his smile twitching ever so slightly. He hadn't expected them here. He hadn't invited them. Their presence was not part of the plan, but he adjusted quickly, shaking hands, redirecting attention, whispering to his assistant to delay the speech by 15 minutes. At 9:10 p.m., the lights dimmed, and the host, a smooth-talking local anchor, took the stage to welcome the guests and transition to the evening's final recognitions. Before we close tonight, the host said, we've invited a special guest to share a brief story about community entrepreneurship and legacy, all things we're here to celebrate. Ashcroft's brow furrowed. The host smiled and gestured to the side of the stage. Please welcome Savannah Post journalist Maris Langley. From the crowd emerged Maris, a journalist known more for investigation than gala appearances. Ashcroft's jaw clenched. He hadn't seen her name on any program. His assistant looked pale. She hadn't arranged. Maris reached the mic with calm confidence. She carried a manila folder in one hand, her voice level as she greeted the room. Thank you. I won't take much of your time. I just want to tell you a short story, one that started in a boutique downtown, involved a teenage girl, and ended with a city learning something about who really owns its future. She paused. The room quieted. Even the waitstaff froze mid-pour. Months ago, a young black woman was thrown out of a clothing store for browsing too long. No yelling, no theft, no disruption, just being there. We've all seen stories like it. But what you didn't see was what happened next. On the screen behind her, a photo appeared. Nova, inside Vivant Wear, adjusting a youth-designed mannequin display. The logo on the wall behind her read, Unapologetic. This is Nova O'Neill, co-founder of Unapologetic, a brand dedicated to youth empowerment and cultural inclusion. The same store that tried to eject her is now being transformed by her. Whispers surged through the crowd. Some clapped hesitantly. Others turned toward Ashcroft, whose smile had vanished. Maris continued. What you also didn't see were the hidden recordings, the staff testimonies, and the forged financial records used to discredit Nova's father, a man who remained silent while his character was dismantled in the press. Now a second slide appeared. It showed Bryce, caught mid-rant, mouth curled in fury. The leaked audio transcript beneath it. This is what's wrong with all of you. You scream racism when you don't get your way. Gasps echoed. Ashcroft's chest rose with quick, shallow breaths. And finally, Maris said, voice sharp, you didn't see these until now. She opened the folder and removed a set of documents, placing them on the podium camera feed. Internal communications between Bryce Danton and Grant Ashcroft, discussing strategic defamation, press manipulation, and a plan to trigger a buyout clause using falsified misconduct claims. The texts were forwarded anonymously by a whistleblower inside Vivant Wear. The crowd now turned fully toward Ashcroft, whose face had drained of its polished charm. His assistant was already on her phone, texting rapidly, likely spinning. Maris stepped aside. Nova walked to the mic, her steps steady. She looked out into a sea of people who had never really seen her. I didn't want to be here tonight. I wanted to fix things quietly. But sometimes silence gives permission to people who count on never being challenged. I'm not here for applause. I'm here for accountability. She looked directly at Ashcroft. I'm not the girl who walked out of that store anymore. I'm the girl who came back to rebuild it. The room erupted, not in frenzy, but in slow, intentional applause, the kind that grows from impact, not instruction. Shaq remained by the back wall, watching, his hands clasped in front of him. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The truth had done all the work. Ashcroft tried to recover, moving toward the stage, but someone stepped in front of him, a board member from his own firm, holding a phone to his ear, whispering something that made Ashcroft freeze in place. The gala ended without his speech. By morning, his stock dipped. His firm released a statement. His name was removed from 2 civic boards. And downtown Savannah buzzed, not with gossip, but with new energy. Unapologetic had just opened its second storefront. Youth-run, community-supported, and fully independent. Reputation was no longer a matter of status. It was a matter of truth, and truth, that night, had walked into the gala without permission and taken the stage. The gold-trimmed sign over the boutique's entrance came down early on a Sunday morning. No cameras, no ribbon cutting, no speeches, just Harper on a ladder, Nova holding the bottom steady, and a few volunteers who had once been ignored inside that very space. They took it down carefully, like peeling off a skin that never fit right. Vivant Wear was gone. In its place, The new sign gleamed in brushed brass, unapologetic by Nova. Clean, intentional. Not trying to impress anyone, but built to include everyone. Below the name, etched in smaller lettering, designed for voice, built with truth. The windows were no longer filled with sterile mannequins in overpriced beige. Now they showcased rotating student collections from local high schools and upstart designers of color. Wall murals by neighborhood youth wrapped inside the boutique, like a second skin. The old layout had been demolished, literally to create an open floor where conversations flowed like the fashion. Bookshelves stood next to fitting rooms, beanbags near checkout. Mirrors had quotes etched in their frames. Power isn't loud, it's clear. Nova stood inside that morning, arms folded, watching Harper finish steaming the last piece for the launch rack, a jacket stitched from recycled denim and dyed with natural ink. It was imperfect, beautiful, real. Harper looked over her shoulder and grinned. "You still nervous?" Nova smirked. "No. Just making sure I can breathe in a moment I never thought I'd be standing in." "You earned it," Harper said. "We all did." The buzz outside was already building. Lines formed early. Not because of hype, but because of hope. Unapologetic wasn't a trend. It was a reset. Meanwhile, a few blocks away, Shaq walked into the gymnasium of his old high school. The same hardwood floor where his sneakers once echoed as a teenager with dreams too big for Savannah to understand back then. Now it echoed with laughter, sneakers squeaking and the thud of basketballs bouncing beneath rusted hoops and aging rafters. A group of boys, middle schoolers, some barely taller than the ball itself, surrounded him during water break. They weren't asking about fame, not about NBA stats or brand deals. They'd seen something else. "Is it true?" one boy asked. "You owned the store that kicked your daughter out?" Shaq chuckled, nodded once. "Yeah, but that's not the important part." Another boy asked, "Why didn't you go off on them?" "If it were me, I'd be yelling." Shaq leaned on the bench, wiping sweat from his forehead with a towel. His voice was calm, steady. "Because yelling makes noise, and noise fades. But doing something different? That stays." They looked at him, puzzled but listening. He added, "When somebody tells you you don't belong, you don't need to prove them wrong with volume. You prove them wrong by building something they can't ignore." Back at Unapologetic, Nova was pulling herself away from the front register when her phone buzzed. A notification from an email address she didn't recognize. She opened it, eyes scanning quickly. Her mouth parted in surprise. Harper noticed. "Good news or weird spam?" Nova blinked, then laughed, more out of shock than joy. "I've been invited to speak at the National Youth Leadership Summit." Harper's eyes widened. "Wait, the summit?" Nova nodded. "In DC, theme this year is ownership, identity and voice. I thought they forgot about me after what happened." Harper leaned back, arms crossed. "Nah, they were just waiting to see what you'd do with it." Nova stared at the screen, her reflection in the glass just faint enough to remind her of the girl who once sat outside Vivint, where after being kicked out, too stunned to cry and too proud to complain. That girl still lived in her, but now she wasn't alone. 2 weeks later, the city woke to headlines not about fashion or protests, but a quiet arrest made at dawn. Real estate mogul Grant Ashcroft arrested in fraud probe. The charges were buried deep, in years of shady land deals, falsified permits, ghost companies tied to shell bidders. It hadn't come from Shaq. It came from a federal investigation that had been building for months. Devon's anonymous leak had lit the final fuse. Ashcroft didn't get handcuffs and flashing lights. He got lawyers and closed-door deals. But he was gone just the same, names stripped from boards, investments unraveling, political dreams evaporate. As for Bryce, he left town without a goodbye. No job references, no farewell party, just an empty apartment, and rumors about a family lawsuit somewhere in the Midwest. He had disappeared into the kind of silence that comes after exposure, not the righteous kind, but the cowards. At the close of that month, Unapologetic hosted its first mentorship showcase. Dozens of students, artists, poets, designers took the stage one by one, sharing work that wasn't just creative but urgent. Their families sat on folding chairs, eyes wet and proud. The boutique wasn't just a store anymore. It was a stage, a statement. Shaq stood in the back, arms crossed, quiet as always. A city council member approached him, clapping his shoulder. "You did good, man. Real good." Shaq just nodded. That night, Nova joined him outside the shop, under the stars, her speech draft for the summit still in her hand. She didn't read it aloud. She didn't need to. They sat on the bench together, watching the crowd filter out, the lights go dim inside, the logo above glowing soft in the night. You always knew I could do this, Nova said. Shaq looked over at her. I always knew you would decide how, he said. She leaned her head on his shoulder, the silence between them filled with everything they'd fought for. And then quietly, as if telling the stars a secret, Shaq said, the loudest victories don't need applause, just silence deep enough to hear what changed. And in that silence, Savannah breathed a little easier, because something had. If this story made you pause, made you think, don't scroll past it. Ask yourself who's writing the stories around you, and who's being written out. Support voices that challenge silence, businesses that stand for more, and change that doesn't beg for permission. This isn't just fiction, it's a mirror, and it's time we all looked closer.